Welcome, Jessie Graves. It is such a pleasure to speak with you again and to see you again, even in this virtual space. I wanted to thank you for coming to KSU, for doing your reading and your Q&A, and for allowing us to partner with the Honors College, with Dean Corweibel, and I had the special honor of being able to teach a class dedicated to the 10th anniversary of your expanded edition, which I have all these poems tab, but I just wanted to thank you for meeting with me and for coming to KSU and for your great work.
Well, Valerie, thank you so much. It's great to see you again, and I had a wonderful time with your students. So impressed with your students, so impressed with your community that you all have around poetry and how it extends over to the Honors College. It was great to see some old friends and make some new friends, and especially to spend time with your class and with your students. It's just delighted by them. They had fantastic questions. They were obviously so well prepared. So congratulations to you on bringing those students together in such a good way.
Appreciate that. Yes, they were thrilled. They had tons of questions, even the ones that couldn't make it to the reading. I tried to take note of the questions that they had for you. And especially just to start off, everyone noticed immediately the themes, right? The past and the present, the family, legacy, heritage, was just immediate in that first section. And it's interesting how that resonated with the students. A lot of folks are, some actually have history in Appalachia, in the Southeast region. And so we were just kind of wondering how, did you intend at the outset of writing these poems that it was intentional that you were going to delve into the past and history and your family legacy, or did that just kind of come about?
Well, that's a great question. I'm glad your students noticed it, and I'm glad they connected with it in that way. I feel like in some ways I am a throwback to an even earlier era of like somebody growing up on family land and family farm, and I know that not many of your students and not many of my students at this point have had a similar kind of experience, and so I'm always really delighted when they can connect to it and maybe have some thoughts of their own about where they came from, where their people came from, who came before them to get them where they are today, and so I appreciate them noticing that. I don't know that I thought of that so much as a theme as I was writing the poems. It's just my natural subject matter. It's just the subject matter that always spoke to me in the poems that I liked best, the poets I was reading. It seemed like from wherever not just Appalachian poets or Southern poets, but poets from wherever I was reading them, the ones that I always gravitated toward seemed to write about their place and to write about their forebears, their ancestors. I think of like Seamus Heaney from Ireland and Derek Walcott. I mean, that was a generation of poets that was really still huge when I was coming along as a young poet, and their work spoke about their places and their people in a way that really was touching for me and important for me to see that. Right. As someone, I felt like I was someone who came from a place that wasn't really all that much written about and wasn't all that from people who hadn't had a lot of voice in the literature. So it was really great for me to discover that sort of rural culture, a culture far removed from where literary things happen. Yes. They were there in some of the poetry, and so I'm always gratified when students can connect to it and can feel like, and I've always hoped that in my poems, you don't have to know the place or to have been to the place, and you don't have to have the same relationship to the grandparents and the great grandparents that I've had to connect to their own situation.
Absolutely. Everything that you just said as far as making that connection with family, it's interesting, especially with the students and some of the poems that they wrote. And we only wrote 3 poems, but they didn't necessarily have to be about or inspired by your work, but it just so happened that they wound up being that because we were reading your work at the same time. And so a lot of poems about grandmothers and grandparents and family definitely came out. Interesting that you mentioned places because by the first and second section, definitely, we started making a running list. And I won't bore you with all the places that you wrote about in your work. But I think once we got to like 20 or 30 different places, we just stopped. It was, and we had fun actually just kind of looking up the places. And I noted that, anytime a poet puts something in their work, we can, as informed readers, look it up. I mean, we have technology now to kind of see where these places are. So that was a thrill for us. And so we found ourselves kind of situated in those places. And it was interesting. I kind of found it like, well, a storytelling technique, as well as situating us as readers in these places. Sometimes it would be a title, Johnson's Ground. Sometimes it would be, or Detroit Muscle, Wrightsville Beach, or like a first line from Tennessee, Landscape with Blighted Pine, Dry Summer, and the Upper Field Quiet at Noon. So we really enjoyed being situated in the places where the poems were taking place. I don't know if that came out as a question or not, but we just really enjoyed that. Did you have any comments on how you decided how to do that for the reader or for yourself?
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, I so much appreciate the closeness and the care that you all took reading these poems. I love that you were thinking about the place names. I mean, that's really so important to me. And I'm delighted that the students wrote some of their own poems in response to some of the themes from mine. I think it's I think when you can connect a reader to a place in your poems, it's gonna encourage them to think about their own places and the places in their own lives and their own histories that have been important to them or important to their people. And so I really appreciate that a lot and value that a lot. I think that listing the places is a way of grounding the experiences for me and grounding the interactions between people and with the landscapes. And I guess I would say that it's a way in which I can make the poems about more than just my home place, like it's Wrightsville Beach is in North Carolina, and of course there are a couple of New Orleans poems. I lived in New Orleans for a year, and I lived in upstate New York for 4 years, and most of my life has been in East Tennessee, but I have I've written about a number of other places as well, and so I feel like you can stretch your canvas a little bit. You can expand the canvas that you're working on by bringing other places in and interacting your place with other places. And so I hope that makes the experience of poems just a little larger and a little more inviting and encompassing for readers.
It definitely certainly did for us. And that was just fun for us to explore those places along with you as we were reading your poems. And speaking even from a narrative perspective, Those were the poems that a lot of the students did enjoy as well, the ones with dialogue. Even though St. Paul, when you look back at it, I think there's only 1 or 2 lines of actual dialogue with the writers of the speaker's Uncle Gerald. It just seems like, but it seems like the whole poem tells a story. There's also his confession that's just especially lyric and has a lot of dialogue in that. The Kate and Jim section of Rural Root Gallery, we really enjoyed the dialogue structure in that narrative. So
super.
That was one thing that we kind of gravitated to as well, the storytelling. And some poets do it well. You obviously do it very well. Is that something that is natural to you? Do you do you like fiction? Is it creative nonfiction? Is it memoir work? Just how do you go about that process?
Well, thank you. That's a great question, and it's a fascinating question for me to sit down and sort of ponder over as you know, I'm working on a couple different poetry manuscripts right now, and sort of thinking about what I've published in the past, what I've written in the past, and what the new work is, and what I hope the future work is. And one of the real threads is narrative. One of the real threads is sharing stories. And I think that the poem, once again, back to my first response, I think the poems that I've always connected with the most are centered around people, and people interacting in their environments and with their places. And I don't write a lot of fiction, actually, but I'll tell you that the poem St. Paul originated 15 years ago or so when I first wrote that first draft of that as a short story. And like so many short story attempts that I've made, the poetry just sort of cannibalizes it. Poetry just like consumes it, and it becomes, I always end up deciding, wouldn't this really be better as a poem instead of a story? So I think I am doing a lot of memoir work, a lot of fiction writing even, or at least fiction writing techniques in my poems, because I just love that sort of narrative connection that you can make between different elements of the different people or situations. And for me, it's a way to write about memories. The St. Paul poem is about my uncle Gerald, who's in my poems a lot. He really crucial figure for my childhood. He lived with my parents and me until I was going off to college, and but the perspective is earlier than my own. It's sort of like from an older cousin. You know, I was sort of writing from my older brother's perspective, my older cousin's perspective. So some of the details in the poem are a little earlier than my own life could have been, but the narrative, being able to connect them through the stories, I think there's a lot of implied story and a lot of implied dialogue in that poem, yes, even though there are only a few lines of actual spoken dialogue.
It is interesting that, thank you for sharing that detail, just as far as that being some of your own memories, some of your older brother's memories, some of your older cousin memories kind of pieced together to make this full Uncle Gerald that I think, and we did see the other poems as well written for him. So that detail does bring, I'll probably share that detail with the class, like, hey, you know, that was just an interesting little side note about Uncle Gerald and those poems. And just the narrative effect of it. I too struggle with, like, I definitely do not write fiction, and they don't have, I tell folks they don't have the, I guess the plot arc that stories are supposed to have. Mine just wind up being character sketches. And again, like you said, wouldn't this just be better off as a poem?
Right.
Right. So that I definitely identify with that myself. Um, and so narrative is kind of theme and a little bit of form. So I had some questions about form as well. Mostly free verse as far as I could tell.
Yeah.
But we do have, especially the book begins before the actual set of poems, we have For the Frozen Wood, which is a pantoum.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for our class, we didn't have enough opportunity to, for the brevity of our class, to dive into the intricacy of that form, especially as beginning for the book. But at 7, I was like, oh, that's 14 lines. And then we move into later with My Sister at Sea, which is so intimate. And I did spend as much time as I could discussing kind of the formal sonnet and the uses of it for something that is such an intimate subject. So did you purpose to write that sonnet for your sister, or how many times, not how many times, but maybe what other forms do you enjoy, or how do you choose that for yourself?
Yeah. Well, thank you for noticing all those elements in the poems. I I love this stuff. I love the formal play and poetry, the kind of intricacies you can get to with the language that form lets you do, and in some ways kind of forces you to do. That the opening poem in the book, For the Frozen Wood, I did not really. That one probably in my first draft started having some rhyming effect in it, and maybe I didn't even notice it right away. And this does happen sometimes. You're writing and you realize, oh, I've got 4 lines, and these two kind of rhyme. They kind of, they have this like echo effect or sound effect that you think, well, maybe this is going to be a rhyming poem, or maybe this content would fit well in a rhyming poem. And with that one, I thought, why not try a rhyming pantoum? Why not and I didn't really envision it as like the preface poem until I got the manuscript put together. But I thought a lot of the themes in the book run through that poem, and there's something about the music of it, of that form, that I really appreciated. And I am mostly writing in free verse, but I also like to do to write in syllabics, which is just unrhymed, unmetered form, but in which you have repeating syllable counts, like 7 syllables per line, or alternating syllable counts. You'll have 9 syllables and then 7 and then 9 and then 7, and you create a pattern like that.
Yeah.
And that's often visible only to the poet, I think. A reader would have no reason to see that at all, unless they're just an obsessive reader, like another poet might be, who would maybe count those syllables. I think a lot about that. I had been reading the poems of Charles Wright, one of my favorite contemporary poets, and also an Upper East Tennessee poet. And I've been reading his poems for at least 10 years before I came across a line in an interview with him once when he said, I've never written any poems, or since my second or third book, I've never written any poems or published any poems that have an even number of syllables in the line.
Oh,
And
wow.
I was like, what? My mind was just like blown, because I'd read all of these poems and I had never noticed that the syllables in the lines were always an odd number of syllables. And it
That is
wasn't the
interesting.
same number. It was just always an odd number of syllables. And I thought, what an intricate design to create for your work that most people will never even see. I love that stuff.
Right. That most people won't be able to notice or appreciate even that. And now I have to go back and try to find those syllables. I could probably use some hints. I'm thinking of the poem at 7, and I'm wondering now if that's 7 syllables across each line, or I don't know. Maybe I'm going too far.
I would probably have to look at that too. I don't know. I feel like that's something that's something that I've maybe done more in later work. But I also love like stanza patterns. One of the things
Yes.
that I've kind of come up on as an organizing principle in poems is like I like 3-line stanzas, I like 4-line stanzas, and I like for those to alternate or to repeat. And
Yes.
that I like a we had the brilliant poet Natasha Trethewey at ETSU a couple semesters ago, and she talked about, we did a little Q&A session with her, and the students had some great questions. And one thing she said was, I think a lot about form, and I think a lot about, I'm paraphrasing, but I think a lot about visual aspects of the poems. And she said, I think about line lengths, and if a line is out way too long, I feel like it's a drawer that hasn't been closed. I feel like it's like you walk into a room and the first thing you see is this open drawer in a dresser. And it's like, I got to close that drawer. And
Exactly.
yeah, to me, that was such a great image, because I think there's something I like about, I love the beat poets. I love some of the wilder, longer line Ginsberg poems, that kind of stuff. But I think mostly for my own poems and the poems that I tend to gravitate more toward are kind of structured poems. They're poems that you feel like you've got a little bit of a roadmap to get through, and you feel a little bit guided along through the poem, like you've got a sort of a friendly guide, bringing you through the poems. So
I definitely get that sense, and I think the students did too. We definitely noticed the 3 lines, the poems with couplets or alternating 2 and 3 lines, like you said, 3 and 4. Some of the, like you said, larger, maybe 5, 6 line structures. That gave us a chance to talk about enjambment and how you structured the lines there. And I'm like, oh no, look at this word there, and it continues on to the next line. It was really a joy for them to notice that, especially what I didn't know if we would have enough time to discuss the structures that you chose, and we did feel that that guide that you used as a writer to guide us along with the structures that you chose. It was definitely felt as much as the tone and the words in your work. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that.
That might dovetail. I know we were talking about your the formal sonnet and the poem that My Sister at Sea that you wrote for your sister, which is just so beautiful. I also like Deep Corner. I was like, oh, there's a sister poem and a brother poem. I really enjoyed that. It made me, so we talked about family and legacy, but it also kind of made me ask, and I think we talked about this before, how you chose the stories that you told, the family stories. And I think the word that you chose to describe it was a tenderness. And I've been thinking about that ever since you spoke with us at KSU, just approaching our family histories with that tenderness. And it's interesting that you mentioned Natasha Trethewey, because as we read your poems, every time a writer came to mind from your work, I would expose the class to that. And there were definitely poems by Natasha Trethewey. I think Elegy, I think by now, The River Must Be Thick. Other poems by David Bottoms came to mind. Claude McKay, Nikki Giovanni, I think we spoke about from her poems from Knoxville. Just so many writers that your poems bring to mind, but just that question again of how we approach our family histories and that memoir aspect with that tenderness that you spoke about.
Well, families can be fraught, and family history can be fraught, and there's often a lot of hardship to work through and a lot of struggle to work through in that. And I came across the idea of tenderness from the poet Galway Kinnell, who at some point along the way I came across him saying another word for poetry could be tenderness.
Mm.
And I always think of that. Like, what is it that I love about poems? What is it that people love about poems? Not just poets, um, but people who find poems often want more of them. They often, poetry doesn't sell books like Stephen King sells books or that kind of thing. But I think that once people discover poetry, they want more of it in their lives. And I think it's often, I think there are a couple things at play there. I think one is poetry poetry asks you to slow down a little bit,
Mm.
where most of life asks you to speed up and do multiple things at one time. And poetry is sort of the opposite of multitasking for me. It's like the focused time and energy. And the idea of tenderness is another thing I think we probably don't have enough of or get enough of in our lives, and certainly in our cultural lives. There just isn't a lot of that in the world, I think, or at least in the sort of pop culture and political culture and I don't know. Think about so many of the interactions we have with strangers are negative.
Yeah.
Like they're driving or they're on planes. Like, why are people going insane on planes all the time now? And why is we're often put into these stressed situations, that I think poetry can be a little bit of an antidote to, even the poems that take that take a hard look at some of the fraught family situations or social or historical situations. I still think there's a kind of intimacy in that is uh, not always available to us in the world right now.
I would agree. I have to agree. And it's just everything that you said just kind of is the thread. I mean, we've got the past and the history and the family, but going even poems from like Firing Order, there were poems that resonated from work and from working the land. But that thread goes all the way through to the poems about your daughter, the poems for Chloe, that
Oh,
are so just intimate and beautiful. So I, like I said, that tenderness thread definitely goes all the way through. So I will be taking note of that as I move forward as a writer, and I'm sure my students did as well. The Wilderness Trail, Echolalia was just a beautiful poems there. Um,
thank you.
that kind of moves forward into what I think you hinted earlier to some things that you're working on now. So wondering for our listeners, if you can give us a hint on what we might be looking forward to.
Yeah, well, yeah, I would love to do that. And thank you for mentioning the Chloe poems. Those are, my daughter is about to turn 25 next month, and so she's grown, and I feel like it's a different world writing about an adult child than writing about a, a little kid. And so in some ways, um, the Chloe childhood poems are my favorite of my poems. They're the ones that mean the most to me and that have been um, the maybe the most important for me to write. And so that was sort of a moment in time in which so much was happening. I was growing up and becoming sort of an adult through Chloe's childhood, and also being connected in some ways back to my own childhood through hers. And so that was really special to me to get to write those. And um, I'm working right now on some poems about my dad, who passed in 2016. And my dad was a farmer, a truck driver. Neither of my parents graduated high school. So I'm first generation college student. It's what I do in my daily life and professional life is so different from um, from what my parents and their parents and sort of generations back. It's so different from what they did, and yet I feel like I learned how to do what I do from my dad. Even though writing poems, reading books, none of that was really in his. I think of all the 10,000 things he might have imagined happening to him. Somebody writing poems about him was not one of them. You know, that was not something he would have ever dreamed of. And yet, I think he was so tickled by that and proud of that in a way, that I was doing something that was my own and that was, um, you know, I don't know that he understood in the beginning what it was I was hoping to accomplish by doing what I was doing, but I think he was so proud that I was working at it and and making something, you know.
Yes. I could again with Tennessee landscape with Blighted Pine. I see that thread, that just that admiration for the work of it is definitely a tribute to our past and our legacies and our histories. It just comes out in a different way, right? It's just it's a different form and a different appreciation of our family histories and how we move that forward. And it's when I know you said that your daughter is in her 20s now. You said that at the reading, it still just blows our minds because we're reading about her in this childhood space. And they're just so beautiful. But I definitely understand. I have a couple poems about my own children, and they are unpublishable, sentimental, just little ditties. But you know, you can't help it. You love them so much. But I wanted to thank you for shedding some light on what we have to look forward to, and that I'm sure that will be just as tender and artfully crafted as a book whenever we do have a chance for that. And you're teaching poetry at East Tennessee State University.
Yes.
Where you grew up. I had one last question, maybe for advice for poets, especially young poets who might be starting out writing about place or writing about their family, their past experiences. Just any advice that you might have for young poets and poets that myself advice.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I would let's see, who said this? Somebody said the first vice is advice. I always love that. but I think writing about what you love is writing about what you care about, writing about what has made the most impact on you is it's hard to go wrong if you're doing that. And even if the poems might feel a little bit too close to share, you don't have to share them. And like you said, there are poems we write because we love the thing that we're writing about, but we don't necessarily share that with everybody. You know, I have tons of poems that will never, well, I don't know if it's tons, but I have a lot of poems that will never circulate out in the world just because they don't do what I want a poem to do. They do maybe what my heart needed to do at that moment, or what I felt like I needed to express just then. And sometimes that's maybe just for me. And I always think of a line from a class I was in with one of my favorite poets, Jack Gilbert, came and did a visiting writer semester at University of Tennessee in Knoxville when I just come back as a graduate student, and I was doing a whole different track. I was doing literature studies. I was going to write about the elegy in the 20th century. I had this whole plan for like what my monograph what my dissertation would be. And then I took Jack Gilbert's workshop and I thought, oh, this is my home. This is my true home. I'd already done an MFA in poetry and I thought this is obviously where I need to be putting my work, where I need to be putting my efforts. And part of what brought that realization back to me was we were workshopping one of my poems in class one day, and it was a poem about Chloe. It was a poem about my daughter, and she was little at that time. And Gilbert said, do you all think this poem is sentimental? And a couple of people said yes, a couple of people said no. And he said, it may be sentimental. And he said, that may be something that the poet has to look at and think about. He said, but in poetry, the risk most worth taking is sentimentality. And I thought, wow, that's so exactly what I needed to hear. And he elaborated and he said, you know, this is where the heart is in the poems. This is where the true feeling in the poems resides, is when you're getting close to the things you care most about. You're getting close to sentimentality. You're getting close to that risk. And so in some ways, it's just a matter of, you know, how do you not overstate the feeling? How do you not over explain or tell the reader how to feel? How do you just show the feeling? And so I think that with time and practice, I got better at that. And I think that, you know, a last piece of counsel that I always give my student poets is, I wish that I had learned earlier that I needed to write more. And that I needed to write, that writing is like anything that you get good at and anything that you really learn how to do. You know, when I was in high school, I played the guitar all the time. I was so into music. And when I was in middle school, I played basketball all the time. I'm really glad you mentioned that Deep Corner poem.
Yes.
I love basketball poems. Thank you.
Yes.
And you know, you just get a lot better at the things that you want to do by practicing them. And so writing a lot, writing more is the way to get better at it.
Excellent, excellent, excellent advice for all writers, not just new writers, all writers. Thank you so much, Jesse. I so very much appreciate this conversation. I've learned a ton already. I can't wait to dive in with all the hints, dive back into the book with some of the hints that you provided for us. Again, thank you for visiting for KSU, for joining up with the Honors College and allowing us to read your work, for meeting with the students, for your generosity as a writer now, today, and forever. Just eternal gratefulness. Thank you so much.
That's totally my pleasure, Valerie. Thank you so much, and I'll be looking forward to when we can meet again.
Excellent. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.